Hello, friends. Steve Stockton here with you. Welcome to Listener Stories, a chilling series where we delve into the depths of the unknown through spine-tingling tales submitted by you, our listeners. From eerie encounters with the supernatural to inexplicable phenomena that defy all logic. Join us as we navigate the shadows of the human experience and explore the darkest corners of the imagination. Each episode promises to leave you on the edge of your seat, questioning what lurks in the darkness and what secrets lie hidden in the night. So dim the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for a journey into the realm of the unexplained. Australian Story. Dear Steve, as promised, here's one of my experiences to share with the group. It's not the most complete story, but it is the one that I am still most baffled about. The interesting thing regarding this experience is that I made up a cover story for the experience and convinced myself this was the correct version of events for years. Only a quantum therapy hypnotist and now you good folk are to hear what actually happened to the best of my recollection. When I was 28 in 2012, I was an avid hiker, bow hunter, traveler, and camper. My job was intense, but due to overtime work, I was usually able to have 4 to 5 days off in a row every few weeks. When this happened, I would always throw a pre-prepared camping kit in my van and head off to the bush. I usually searched for the more remote, less visited places, and if I felt like hunting, I searched out state forest land where bow hunting non-native wildlife was legal. I was only ever after rabbits as they're considered a pest here, and I used almost every part of the animal. I no longer hunt animals, but I don't regret having the knowledge or skill in my metaphorical toolkit. This trip, I tacked on 2 weeks overtime onto 4 weeks annual leave, so with 6 weeks up my sleeve, I planned a longer road trip north up the east coast of Australia. I met 2 wonderful Belgian guys on my travels, and we ended up traveling together for most of my holidays, but I'd broken away from them at Mount Kosciuszko to have a night or 2 by myself to go hunt. I no longer recall the name of the state park I'd found. All I remember is that it was a few hours' drive, most likely northwest of Mount Kosciuszko. The remoteness of the park, plus the fact that it was midweek, practically guaranteed that no one would be using the campsite. It was a lot longer trip than the map led me to believe, though, as the last 30 kilometers into the forest to the campsite was on heavily rutted dirt track. Nowadays, I wouldn't attempt such a road in the tiny Toyota Town Ace van that I had at the time, but I was slightly younger, slightly overconfident in my old van's abilities, and keen to be in the middle of nowhere by myself. That 30 kilometers of track took me over an hour to negotiate, my rear tires slewing left and right the whole drive. When I finally arrived at the campsite, it was worth the stress of the drive. Settled in the bowl of a valley with a charming meadow, with facilities I didn't expect, iron fire cooker trays that swing out onto your campfire, decent long drop toilets, and well-kept grass sites to camp on. I was gratified that I had the place to myself too, as I had expected. The first thing I did was park up at a fire pit and string up my longbow because, there were rabbits everywhere, not 100 meters away from me. They were leery of humans though, and I could not get close enough for a confident shot. So eventually I packed my gear in my van and settled in to sip whiskey by the fire and watch the sunset slip below the valley walls. Now, here's the thing. When I was settling in, after the excitement of the rabbits had dissipated, I had a gut feeling that I didn't really want to be there. I've had these feelings before when I pull up to one camp spot or another, and I usually pack up, no questions asked, and move on. Call me paranoid, but I've learned to trust my gut feelings. In this instance, though, I really couldn't face the prospect of that long, hazardous drive back out that late in the day, so I dampened the feelings with another whiskey and retired to my van about 9 p.m. Here's where there is a diverging of my memory. I've told this version of the story more than a few times, and there's a part of me that can still see it and feel it happening. If it's not too confusing for the narrative, I'll share this recall of the events first, then come back to what I believe actually occurred. Gunshots woke me around 1 a.m. I sat up and heard another shot ring out, but it sounded like the shots were fired over the other side of my little valley, and as this was a hunting area, it didn't stress me too much. I went back to sleep. I was woken again around 2 a.m., this time to shots that sounded like they were taken from inside my valley. The report of the rifle was sharper, closer. This made me a little nervous, as I hoped they knew not to shoot down the valley into the camping ground. But again, I fell back into a fitful sleep. I was woken a final time because it was bright in my van all of a sudden, and heard the crunching sound of tires rolling over gravel. A heavy-sounding vehicle drove into the campsite and parked almost nose to nose with my van, high beams on. My van has a raised platform inside on which I've made a bed, and curtains hanging at every window, which were drawn, so no one outside could see in and I couldn't see out. I remember being terrified and grabbing my hunting knife, curling into a ball in the center of the bed, and sitting there, straining to hear. All I could think was, what did these people think they were doing, coming right up to my van with their high beams on? Were they just locals trying to scare me? Or something worse? I honestly thought this was where I became another camper fallen victim to a serial killer in the bush. I remember being so scared my brain just turned to white noise. No rational thoughts entered, just a rushing of adrenaline and fear. After I don't know how long, the car revved its engine and the headlights started to swing away, and I heard the car leave the campsite via the only road in or out. I sat awake until daybreak, still charged with fear they would come back, and as soon as it was light enough, I crept outside to make sure they weren't there, hiding, and packed up and drove out. So that's what I, for a while, believed occurred that night, or taught myself to believe that's what occurred, because it made sense. It was scary as hell, but it had a certain kind of reason to it. Although, even when I was telling this story over the years, something in me was telling me I was telling a lie. It made for a great, scary campfire story, though, so I stuck with it, even when I had niggles that I wasn't telling the truth. Here is what I now believe to be what actually occurred that night in the valley. It's not as cohesive or as eventful as my self-created story, but it is what I think is the truth. I did hear gunshots that night. They woke me up several times, and I remember thinking that I hoped they knew not to shoot down into the campground. The shots fired did make their way from outside my valley to the inside, as I definitely remember hearing the difference in report from the rifles. There 100% was a white, all-encompassing light in the early hours of the morning. I distinctly recall what this light looked like, filtered through the blue, pink, and green material of my curtains. It lit up the interior of my van like daylight. I definitely grabbed for my knife at one stage, as I found it on my bed the next morning. Apart from that, I cannot remember anything, apart from a terrible, visceral fear. The next event I clearly remember is poking my head out of my van when it was light enough to see outside. I stumbled around the outside of the van, feeling drained, lost, and hungover, although I really had not had that much to drink the night prior. I made coffee to wake myself up and left as soon as possible. I was very spacey, driving that horrific road back out to the highway, but felt a huge relief when I was back in civilization. It confused me, having these two versions of events parallel in my mind, and I always felt compelled to tell the car and the high beam story, even embellished it over time. The real story is less dramatic, but for me, just as terrifying. A few years later, 2018, when I turned 33, I started researching all I could about UFOs, ETs, etc., etc. It was a huge passion all of a sudden to find out as much as I could about these topics. I started to come to a sort of understanding about our world that is very different than what we've been taught to believe. I went and had a quantum therapy hypnosis session, which was very interesting and enlightening, and I'd asked the hypnotist to please ask my subconscious the question about what really occurred that night in the valley. Apparently, my subconscious either doesn't remember either or didn't want to say, because the answer was, "You're not ready." So there you have it, one of the weirdest events of my life, and I still don't have answers to share with you. The obvious conclusion one could come to was this was a visitation of some kind with another race. As I honestly don't know, I'm not going to jump to conclusions and figure I'll find out when I'm ready or meant to. Thanks for listening to my story. I appreciate having found you, Steve, and this group of like-minded souls. Blessings always, Jackie. The Man in the Fog. Hello, I would like to share a story from when I was a kid. When I was around 12, me and my cousins used to like to go to a local school just down the street. Had a large area where you could play soccer, basketball, and had a small playground. One night, we went out after dark to the park. 2 girls, 2 boys. We played around a while, then decided we had enough and headed home. I do not recall there being much fog when at the park, but I turned for some reason and looked at the other end of the park. There was fog over there by a soccer net. Not sure what made me look over there. There was a street light, and suddenly a figure of a man appeared through the fog. He looked big, wearing a long coat. I could not see any of his features. It was just blackness. I told my cousins, and they saw the man. We started to run back home. The boys were faster than us girls. I ran, but didn't feel I was going fast enough. My other cousin, she fell behind, and she screamed at me to slow down, not to leave her behind. She grabbed at me, and I felt terror. We never looked back, but we made it back to the house, out of breath. I'm not even sure if it was a real man or not. That always stayed in my memory. What happened there? Signed, Barbara. Maybe it wasn't a ghost? My name is Margaret, but people call me Marty. I want to share something I recently learned. This is literally the first time I've tried putting this into words, so please make allowances. I've recently found your channel, and I've been catching up with your content. I've listened to the story you told about the first time you saw a ghost. It was the full-bodied apparition of a child. I'd like to suggest that maybe it wasn't a ghost. Here's the reason why. When I was a little girl growing up in the 1960s, I lived in a nice, quiet neighborhood. Down the street, there was an old couple who had a Coke machine on their front porch. People in the neighborhood or driving by would stop and buy a soda. That was how they made extra money. One day, I was on my way to buy a Coke and saw an old man standing in a field. He reminded me of my grandfather, but probably only because he was wearing overalls. I was more interested in the field. It was large and well mowed. No trees or bushes, the perfect place to play baseball or kickball. I wondered why we had never used it before, a situation I planned to remedy ASAP. As I was walking past, the old man saw me. He smiled and said good afternoon. I smiled back and said hello. He began to say, "It's nice weather where..." At that moment, a bird flew past close to my head, startling me. "Having, isn't it?" I heard his voice drift away, but he was already gone. I looked at the empty field. There was nothing he could have hidden behind, no place he could have gone. Besides, I had still heard his voice, but he was gone. I stood there puzzled for a moment longer, but there was no way to make sense of it, so I continued down the street and bought my Coke. It had to be a ghost. There was nothing else it could have been. I never wanted to believe in ghosts, but my grandmother took ghosts as a part of life, and sometimes there is no other explanation. Then, on the way back home, the field was gone. This threw me for a loop. Ghosts were one thing. A ghost could disappear, but land? Land was supposed to stay where it was. Down the street, each little house sat on its small plot of land. I recognized them all. There was no field. That was why we'd never played there. It did not exist. There were houses, then the laundromat on the corner, the side street that ended on our street. Across the street from the laundry was LaTanya and Gwen's house. We played with them most days. That was where the field had been. The laundry hadn't been there, neither had the side street or Latanya's house. There had been a field. But how? How was that possible? That missing field bothered me more than any ghost. Where had that field come from? And even more importantly, where had those houses gone? I couldn't make sense of it. I would tell this story to a few people, but never to anyone who knew the neighborhood. Never to anyone who could say, "There's no field over there." I would tell them about the vanishing man, but not about the vanishing field. I had a few other experiences with land changing that I won't talk about now, but I had one recently that involved a person, and it reminded me of yours. I was in the parking lot at the grocery store. I was driving slowly because I was near the doors and people were going in and out. I wanted to get into the lane leading out, but I had to wait for break in foot traffic. While I waited, I noticed a boy walking fast up the aisle between the cars toward the doors. Just my luck, he was going to be right in front of me about the same time the exiting traffic would clear. I sighed and leaned back to wait. I watched him come up beside me through the car windows. He was maybe 17. He was thin and wearing a white t-shirt with lime green shorts that sported a print of white palm trees. He had on white tube socks and sneakers. He was almost in front of the car. If no one else came out, I could leave in a second. He stepped past my side window and vanished. It was as if he stepped through a slit in the outdoors. There 1 second, gone the next. Just like the little boy you saw. I think there are dimensions that are very close to ours. So close that sometimes they bleed through. I wouldn't call myself a religious person, but I do read the Bible more than most, and I study it closely. The Bible says that all time is now. I suppose that to mean that now is the only time that counts, the only point that any action can be taken. But what if that is not all it means? What if it literally means all time is now? All things existing at the moment, the only difference being how we experience it. What if the 17th century, which we experience as the past, is actually still happening right now? What if dimensions are laid out like silk fabric on a stretcher with only millimeters between? And what if every now and then they touch? And when they do, the two blend a bit. Like seeing the design of one fabric through the other. The fabric of time. When they come apart, everything goes back to its place. Most of the time, but not always. Sometimes a person or thing might be left on the wrong side. I wonder if somewhere there is an old man in farmer's overalls who once saw a little girl disappear right in front of him while he was talking to her. You had a guest who talked to you about his haunted house. He spoke of hearing this lady sing hymns and seeing her standing at the top of the stairs looking down at him. What if they share the same house, but not the same fabric of time? She's living there in the 1800s, and he in the 2000s. Imagine the strange specter she saw at the bottom of the stairs. How could she even explain a ghost from a future time? I think that little boy you saw might not have been a ghost, but an inadvertent traveler on the fabric of time. Sincerely, Marty. A skinwalker? This is not about a translucent humanoid, but something I did see. A few years ago, I was taking a new way for me to the Grand Canyon, Highway 64 from Williams, Arizona. So since I didn't know that route, I drove cautious and slower than normal, pick up my husband who was going to be coming up from a week-long hike in the Grand Canyon in the morning. On a desolate part of the road, there were some trees on the right side of the road and a big field to the left of me. The road was higher than the field or where the trees were. I saw a man starting to cross the road from right to left up the road, so I slowed down even more. He wasn't running, but walking fast and looked like he was going to fall over frontward. I really slowed down, and he looked at me, then kept looking forward, still falling forward, and he morphed into a deer and jumped the fence to the field. The grass was high, about to the now deer's belly. I stopped my car. I couldn't believe what I just saw. I know what I saw. I've never experienced seeing something like this before and didn't know what I just saw. When I got to my friend's home, a ranger at the park, I told her about it. Her husband said, "Oh no, you saw a skinwalker." I'd never heard of such things. I asked my Navajo friends when I got back to the Verde Valley where we live, and she said, "This is exactly what you saw." They are well known in the Navajo culture, and she told me a lot about them. Well, this is my strange but very true story you might be interested in. Thanks, Michelle. Australian Bush Encounter. Hi guys. First off, I just want to say how much I enjoy your YouTube videos of the strange and unusual, even though they make my blood run cold at times. My bizarre encounter took place around 2000 or 2001 in a remote bush area of the Brisbane Ranges, just northwest of the city of Geelong in southeast Australia. It was a fine afternoon, so my partner at the time, I'll call him Jim, and I decided to go and find a nice spot for some river fishing. We had our large Mastiff dog with us, as we always did when we went fishing. We drove around looking for an area we hadn't fished before and found an isolated spot near a small bridge on a back road. There was an overgrown track running beside the river, what I assume was a fire track where rural fire trucks could refill their tanks during a bushfire. So we drove down this track a short distance, got our rods and gear out, and started fishing. After a while, I became bored with getting no bites, so I told Jim I was taking the dog and going for a walk further down the track to find a better spot to fish. The area was quite heavily wooded, and in a short time I could no longer see Jim. After a few minutes, I came to a clearing by the riverbank. As I stood looking around to see if there was any point throwing a line in, I noticed my dog had stopped sniffing around and she was staring intently across the river. The river at that point was about 30 meters or 100 feet across, and the opposite bank was very steep, at least a 45-degree incline. It was covered in scraggly shrubs, saplings, dead branches, and gum trees. As I realized my dog had spotted something, I saw she was rigid and her hackles were up. She then started growling in a way I've never heard before. It was so low I could actually feel it through my body. I'd never seen her react that way before, even when she'd seen a possum or a kangaroo. With a feeling of dread, I stood frozen in place, the hair prickling on the back of my neck, straining to see what she was looking at. Suddenly, all hell broke loose. Something on the opposite bank flew down the steep hill diagonally from right to left. Through the sparse shrubs, I saw a dark, hairy figure the size of a very large man. Its strides were long and sure-footed. Its arms were swinging. Dried leaves went flying, and I heard dead branches snapping under its weight. My dog went berserk, barking madly, and I had to lunge at her to grab her collar because she was about to jump into the river. I was absolutely shocked. What the hell had I just seen? Still gripping the frantic dog by her collar, I immediately headed back to Jim, my head spinning. Jim met us partway down the track. He'd become concerned when he heard the chaotic barking. I could barely put two words together, but I finally managed to blurt out, "I think I just saw a yowie." He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. After telling him what I'd witnessed, he laughed and said it must have been a kangaroo. I told him there was no way it was a kangaroo. They don't stride like that, and they certainly don't have arms that swing. The creature I saw ran down that steep hill, 1 foot in front of the other. It was more physically human than animal, but no human alive could have pulled off a stunt like that without breaking their neck. That few short seconds somehow changed my life. I believe I had the amazing experience of glimpsing something that very few Australians will ever see. And to be honest, this creature was likely just as terrified of my dog and I as we were of it. I hope he didn't have nightmares about us. Thank you for reading my story. Signed, Maria, Geelong, Australia. The Swinging Light. One dark night, my parents, sister, and I were on our way home along an Alaskan highway. I don't recall who saw it first, either was my sister or I, but there was a bright light to our left far up in the sky. It seemed to be lower than jets flew and higher than bush planes flew. It was flying in a swinging motion, far to the left, then to the right. We got our parents' attention, and we were all trying to keep an eye on it. Then, in around a few seconds, the light stopped quickly. Then it shot straight up and was gone. We were amazed. Me and my sister just thought it was a UFO, and that was that. It still sticks in my mind and makes me wonder. Signed, Barbara. Dad's Encounter. Hello, Steve. I greatly enjoy and appreciate your podcast. Just wanted to share some unexplainable scary stories my father shared with me that happened throughout his life. My father passed away a few months ago. We were very close and shared the same interest of the unexplained and paranormal. I figure by writing these down on paper and others hearing them, a part of him will go on and be remembered. My father told me, my brother and sister about these things happening dozens of times, and never once did the stories change. Number 1, my father grew up during the 1940s. He was one of 8 brothers and sisters. He was about 8 years old at this time. They had a large family. The house they lived in was fairly large but old. It had a history behind it. During this time period of the 30s and 40s was during the Depression era. Life was hard in general. When family members or friends passed away, for financial reasons, they would have wakes in the front bedroom of the house. This happened several times, according to my father. Anyway, this particular room was his bedroom. My father said several nights he would go to bed on his own. When he'd get in the bedroom, he'd sit on the side of the bed to take his shoes off and get ready for bed. While sitting there, it would feel as if someone sat down right beside him. He said the mattress on the bed would move. It would even have an imprint on it, as if someone sat down beside him. He said it felt like someone sitting right there. I asked my dad, "What did you do?" He said it scared him, of course, but it scared him more to go and risk waking his alcoholic father, so he would just go ahead and lay down and pull the covers up over his head. Eventually, he'd fall asleep. He told his mom, but she said for him not to worry. If it was anyone, it was his uncle who had died in that room of tuberculosis. He wouldn't hurt him. My dad already knew about the wakes that were held in this room. Now this? He didn't know what to do, so he did his best just to ignore it. He also said that he always felt like he was being watched in that room as well, and that it stayed freezing in that room during the night. Fast forward to when I myself was growing up. I was between 5 and 8 years old, and my father would take me to visit my grandmother. While they would sit and talk in the living room, I would always go exploring throughout the rest of the house. This particular room, I always got a weird sense when I was in it. It was always filled with sunlight during the day, and I'd get a feeling like my father described, as if you weren't alone and were being watched. After my grandmother passed away, the house was sold. It still stands to this day. A few years ago, I found out that my wife's aunt bought the house. We were out driving, and I asked if we could stop and visit, so we did. While we were there, I didn't say much. We sat in the living room, and I just looked around at the remodeling. Through small talk, her aunt brought up the fact that her daughter would not sleep in her bedroom. She said she felt like someone was watching her, so she slept in the living room. I never said anything, even though I already knew which room it was. I honestly didn't want to scare any of them, considering they hadn't lived there but a month. Second story, this takes place during the 1960s. Before my father and mother got married and any of us kids were born, they went on a date one night. As many couples would do during that time period, they would go driving around into the drive-in. The end of the night, they'd go parking. My father had a secluded spot where he would drive to for privacy that was located outside of town. The spot was surrounded by woods and no houses for miles. After he got so far, the road would end and he would have to drive on an old dirt path that led to a creek. He took my mom out to this location several times. This time, however, he decided to drive out in the middle of the creek and park. The water wasn't but about a foot or so deep, so he parked in the middle of this creek and turned off the engine. He said it was pitch black and quiet. The water in the creek was even still. As he sat there with my mother inside the car, they were talking. and all of a sudden they heard a loud thump 2 times on the trunk of the car. When my father heard this, he thought somebody was messing with him. It was probably someone he knew, so he used his foot to hit the brake light as soon as he heard the 2 thumps. At the same time, he turned around figuring the brake lights would light up whomever it was back there, but he didn't see anyone. Still not convinced and wanting an explanation, my father opened the driver's side door and stood up, looking around the back of the car. There was nothing. Then my dad realized how quiet it was. If someone had walked out there to hit the trunk of his car, they would have to step through the creek water, making sounds. He would have heard that. At this point, my dad said he jumped in the car, started up, and got the hell out of there. Story 3. This takes place in 1988. My family had just moved into a new house, and it was an older house, but it was new to us. My mother and father hadn't had a night alone for years and decided one night early on to have a date night, then get a motel room and stay in. At this time, I was about 5 or 6 years old, and my sister was 16. So it was just us. She was babysitting me, so to speak. She said Mom and Dad deserved time together. They hardly ever did anything. So we spent time fixing popcorn, watching movies all night. Hours had passed. It was at this time about 1 in the morning, and my sister asked me if I was ready for bed. I said yes, so we went from the living room to the kitchen to get a drink of water, brush our teeth, and use the bathroom before bed. Where our kitchen was located, there was a back door, and you could step out onto the back porch. While we were standing in the kitchen, we heard a noise or movement on this back porch. At the same time, we both looked at each other and asked, "Did you hear that?" I was only 6 years old, but I wanted to make my sister feel safe and do what my dad would have done in the same situation. So I went and opened the door and stepped outside onto the back porch. It was dark and quiet, but I didn't see anything. Why I did this, I'll never know. Why my sister let me do this, I'll never know. I said, "Is anyone out there? I've got a gun." I'm sure that was believable and terrifying coming from a small 6-year-old boy. Of course, I didn't have a gun, but there was nothing there, so I came back in the house and my sister locked the door. We walked through the house until we got to the living room, turned everything off, then went to the bedroom to lay down and go to sleep. It was summertime and was very hot. This time we didn't have air conditioning, we just had fans, and when it was hot, we would put the fans in our windows at night to help cool things down. My sister had already fell asleep. I was laying there with my head and face facing towards the window. I thought I saw someone peeking in the window. I closed my eyes really hard and reopened them. They were gone. I thought it was my imagination. Soon, I went to sleep too. The next morning, my sister and I got up at the same time and went into the living room to find our mother and father talking. They both looked very concerned. My father looked pissed. It turned out that the night before we'd heard something on the back porch in the kitchen. Someone had gotten a chair off our back porch and used it to stand on so they could peek in our kitchen window on that side of the house. Not only that, but this sicko had moved our picnic table to climb on and peek into the living room window. There were a bunch of cigarette butts all around 3 different windows of our house. So it wasn't my imagination of seeing someone peek into our front bedroom window after all. This creep just stood out there watching us. The creep went to a lot of trouble using and moving things in front of our window so he had something to stand on and could see through the top of the window. When I went outside on the back porch, I couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 feet away from this maniac. I'll also add that we did not live in the country. We lived in town and had houses with neighbors all around us. Since we were new in this neighborhood and recently moved in, we hadn't learned this yet, but many of our new neighbors had problems with a peeping Tom recently. I've had many creepy things happen throughout my lifetime, but this was by far the creepiest. Never leave window blinds and curtains open. Always test these from the outside at night to make sure nobody can look in on you. I get the feeling there are more of these creeps out there than anyone realizes. Thanks, Steve. Signed, Philip. BC Sasquatch. My name is Lynn. I'm now 49 years old. I grew up in between the Fort Langley and Walnut Grove communities located in the lower southern region of British Columbia, Canada. I lived in a beautiful area that had lots of undeveloped land at that time. There were some areas of land that were scarcely populated between Highway 1 and the Fraser River, extending from Port Kells to Fort Langley. We're talking miles of land. I could hear coyotes cackling and wailing all night, every night. It was so quiet back then, and I miss it. There were ponds and small riverways here and there throughout the still largely forested region. Walnut Grove was newly named because it was a new community. It was known as West Langley before the crazy house building frenzy began. Because British Columbia has a rich history of Sasquatch sightings and encounters, and our native communities have these Sasquatch people carved into masks and totem poles, I've always been in the know about their existence. I've always had an interest in the topic. Back in those days, I, like every other white person, believed they were some kind of physical ape-like creature of enormous size and weight covered in hair. This view of their being has changed somewhat as more people share Sasquatch experiences with the aid of the internet. I now don't believe Sasquatch people are apes at all. The natives here, from the Kwantlen Nation, have always claimed Sasquatch are a being that can appear and disappear at will. Cloaking is another belief. When I was young, I used to think these tales were embellishments or hocus-pocus tales. Not anymore. Who knows Sasquatch people better than the First Nations people? Nobody. I think our true understanding of what Sasquatch people are and their abilities is still in its infancy and is ever expanding. In those years as a boy, I frequented the trails that were close to my home alone almost every day. That's what us kids did back then, unlike most kids today. And most of the trails were originally animal pathways that us kids cleared with axes and machetes. The trees were very tall and were in every direction. There were some grass clearings here and there, but not many. There was an SPCA animal shelter near these heavily wooded trails, but it was later shut down and the building left abandoned. Anyway, in around 1983 after school and with lots of light left in the afternoon, a friend and I were walking our trails. We hadn't been there too long. We were babbling and carrying on just like any other day when we could hear something walking with us. It stopped when we stopped. It walked when we walked. At first, we simultaneously stopped walking and talking and looked around for where the footfalls were coming from. But neither of us could see anything. We looked at each other, shrugged, and started on again. And it would start along with us. It sounded like it was right there with us. We stopped and started only a couple of times, and we finally looked at each other one last time, turned and ran as fast as we could. I don't think we touched dirt more than 10 strides before we hit the opening of the trails at the road. We were so scared. We never ended up in those trails together again after that day, and my zest for them was cured from that experience. I tried to go in there a few times again as a kid, but they felt different. I was afraid. By 16, I had a car and discovered girls, so my exploring days kind of ended. In the early 2000s, I did go in those trails as an adult. I did so because, like most of us, I missed my youth. I missed those carefree days as a boy. And because things never stay the same. Walnut Grove was still in the grips of expanding, as was the neighboring industrial community of Port Kells. Just like the song Telegraph Road from Dire Straits, this area has disappeared due to human development. The woods are gone. I'm sure the thing that inhabited them is gone too. This experience never left my memory. Was it a Sasquatch or some other and yet unknown creature? I'll never know. But I swear on my father's grave it did happen. And there was something close, pacing us in those woods. Signed, Lynn, Kelowna, BC, Canada. Well, friends, let us know what you think about these stories in the comments below, but please be respectful of the opinions of others. And if you have any strange stories you would like to see featured in an upcoming video, email them to nationalparkmysteriesyt@gmail.com. We're very interested in stories that detail encounters with ghosts, humanoids, cryptids, or any type of other unknown entity that is beyond explanation. Thanks again for listening, and please be sure to give us a like on the video and to share and subscribe for more strange stories. Meanwhile, be good to yourselves and each other. I'm Steve Stockton, and I'll talk to you next time.